I love mud, so thanks so much, Brad, for that introduction. I did go back and finish calculus, so don't worry. Okay, cool. Thanks everyone for coming today. I'm excited to tell you all a little bit about my research studying salt marsh morphodynamics and blue carbon burial. I'd first like to start just sort of defining the systems that we'll be talking about today. I'm really interested in studying salt marshes within the intertidal zones of estuaries. And so the intertidal zone is the portion of the estuary that is variably inundated with the tides. And within the intertidal zone, it turns out that elevation tends to be a really good predictor of habitat type. So at the lowest elevations, we typically have unvegetated mud or tide flats. Moving up in elevation, we have vegetated low marsh. These are considered to be transition habitats. And then at higher elevations, we have vegetated high marsh. These tend to be these more mature systems. Going up even further in elevation, we start getting into more freshwater systems like scrub shrub wetlands and tidal forested swamps. And so the main two reasons why I'm interested in studying salt marshes is because we think that they might be really good recorders of changes in marine and terrestrial spheres, and also because salt marshes provide important ecosystem services. And so my research falls within the broader context of source to sink sediment dynamics. So material that is produced in uplands gets transported and altered, typically through rivers, and then ultimately ends up in the marine and coastal spheres. And so I'm really interested in sediment, which is important for fueling the geomorphology of coastal systems. But carbon is often associated with that sediment. And of course, carbon is important for how we understand climate change. So I'm also interested in carbon as well. And so these coastal sinks are these really complex dynamic systems that are influenced by both marine and terrestrial processes. But if we can assess how these various marine and terrestrial drivers combine to affect the intertidal sink, then we can study the intertidal sink to sort of backcast changes in marine and terrestrial spheres. So we have some excellent circular logic going on. The second reason why I'm interested in salt marshes is because they provide important ecosystem services and functions. And so these include things like flood protection for often vulnerable coastal communities and for infrastructure like roads and airports. They also provide valuable habitat for fish, shellfish, birds, and other species. These are also areas of recreation and of subsistence. Salt marshes filter sediment nutrients and pollutants, thereby improving water quality. And of course, they are areas of rapid carbon burial, or at least we think. But despite their importance, salt marshes are increasingly being threatened by climate and land use changes. Okay, so what controls the morphology of salt marshes? So the growth of salt marshes is controlled by the interplay between inundating water, which brings much needed sediment, and then also biomass productivity, which tends to peak at higher elevations where salt stress is more limited. And so these controls influence the morphology and the sediment characteristics of salt marshes in ways that I would characterize as variably well understood. So we generally understand that the carbon contents will increase at higher elevations where biomass productivity is highest, and bulk densities will tend to be greatest at lower elevations where mineralogenic sediment falls out of suspension first. I'd say that these two terms are relatively well established, but how these various controls kind of combine to influence sediment accretion rates and carbon burial rates is possibly more of an open question. We definitely have theoretical and empirical models, but I think a lot of important questions remain. And so the overarching question of much of my research has been to assess what's controlling the rates of salt marsh sediment accretion and carbon burial. And my approach has been to set up natural laboratory experiments to test the influences of things like sea level rise, sediment supply, land use, which ultimately often impacts sediment supplies, tectonics, which ultimately ends up impacting sea level rise, and then biomass productivity. And so I'm going to move through each of these four different parts as sort of like vignettes or chapters or whatever you want to call it. And I've decided to focus on my graduate research in Oregon because it tells a nice little story. I have little bonus chapters at the end of each to sort of indicate my current and future work. And so I thought we could circle back to some of those bonus parts if anyone is particularly interested. Okay, so again, we're going to move through this list, and we'll start by asking, how does sea level rise and sediment supply combine to affect sediment accretion and carbon burial rates? And so the first question that I'll explore in this part is, what are the relative influences of relative sea level rise and fluvial sediment supply on sediment accretion and carbon burial in 7 Oregon salt marshes? Okay, just a little bit more background on how we think that salt marshes grow. So our long-held understanding is that as relative sea level rises, it creates accommodation space, or the volume within which sediment can accumulate. As sea level rises, it also increases the hydro period, or the time over which the marsh platform is inundated. And so long as there's available suspended sediment in that inundating water, and there's vegetation to trap that sediment, we expect that the salt marsh will grow at a 1-to-1 pace with sea level rise. So if relative sea level is rising at 1 millimeter per year, then we expect the salt marsh will grow at 1 millimeter per year. And so we use this conceptual relationship, this theoretical understanding, in our assessments of salt marsh vulnerability to drowning and in terms of our morphodynamic models. But we don't actually observe this relationship in the empirical data. So here's a global, in quotes, compilation by Matt Kerwin and his colleagues looking at relative sea level rise rates on the x-axis against sediment accretion rates for high and low marsh systems. And so what we would expect to see here is that if our conceptual relationship is correct, that all of these high marsh green points should fall on the 1-to-1 line, indicating that sediment accretion is mirroring relative sea level rise. And clearly that's not what we're seeing here. So it's not surprising that a lot of these green points and some of the blue are falling below the 1-to-1 line, because that's indicating that the salt marshes are submerging or they're drowning. Basically, they're not accreting at the same pace as sea level rise. So over time, they're going to be lost. But what is surprising are all the values that fall above the 1-to-1 line, indicating vertical accretion beyond the rate of relative sea level rise. So basically, they're accreting faster than accommodation space is being created. And so I think this does a really nice job of highlighting that this conceptual understanding is much too simplistic, right? We're either missing additional parameters, or maybe we're not looking at this in terms of the right time scale. It's also at this point, too, that I want to point out that most of our global compilations, or what we term to be global, focus on systems typically in mid-latitudes along passive margins in the global north. So most of this data is coming from the US East and Gulf coasts and Europe. And so I think this does also a nice job of highlighting that we need to expand our understanding to more tropical and polar regions and along tectonic margins. Okay, so I've extended this data set to the Oregon coast, which I think in a lot of ways provides a really nice opportunity to assess the drivers of salt marsh morphodynamics, because we can set it up as an ideal natural laboratory. So spatially, there are over 20 different estuaries that vary in terms of the parameters that I've written up here. And so to address the question of how does sea level rise and sediment supply combine to affect accretion, I simply chose 7 estuaries that displayed variable rates of sea level rise and fluvial sediment supply. Okay, once I'd selected the 7 estuaries, I collected 72 sediment cores. I then performed fairly standard procedures on these. First, I CT scanned the cores, which is cool because we get these GIFs of the down core stratigraphy, and we can see if there's bioturbation, which is bad. We can also extract dry bulk density from the CT scans. Once they're scanned, we cut them open, we section, we dry, and then we measure sediment accretion rates using XSL210 by gamma spectrometry. Once we have sediment accretion rates, then we can move on to measuring carbon contents, and I did this by a combination of LOI and CHN analysis. Okay, so one of the ultimate goals of this work was to determine what's controlling carbon burial. And in a lot of ways, this is a foregone conclusion because we have an equation for calculating carbon burial. So the carbon burial rate is the product of the sediment accretion rate multiplied by the organic carbon content multiplied by the dry bulk density. And towards the beginning of this talk, I noted that organic carbon and dry bulk density tend to be controlled by elevation. And so just to sort of indicate to you all that this trend is holding true in Oregon, I've plotted mean organic carbon contents and dry bulk densities over the top 50 centimeters of the 72 Oregon sediment cores against V star, which is a relative elevation term. So basically elevation normalized to tidal height. And we see a pretty nice relationship here. But what I think this equation does a really nice job of highlighting is that if we want to better understand what controls carbon burial rates, then we need to better understand what's controlling the sediment accretion rate. Okay, so what's controlling sediment accretion rate? So what I have plotted here on the y-axis is the accretionary balance, which is simply the sediment accretion rate minus relative sea level rise. So if our long-held conceptual understanding is correct that salt marshes should be accreting at a 1-to-1 pace with sea level rise, then all these accretionary balances should be 0. If the accretionary balance is negative, then that indicates that the salt marsh is drowning because it's not accreting at a pace equal to sea level rise. If the accretionary balance is positive, then that means the salt marsh is accreting much faster. And so if I hadn't plotted any of the data here, I think what we'd all likely expect is that each of these 7 estuaries would display a trend in which those with the greatest sediment loads would probably be the ones that are accreting the fastest. And I would argue that even though it's not exactly perfect, I do think that's what we're seeing. The first thing I want to point out is that the way that I have estimated fluvial sediment delivery to these estuaries is using the USGS Sparrow model. And the USGS Sparrow model models sediment supplies from the upper watershed. Youngs Bay is attached to the Columbia River estuary, which to my knowledge is the only river in the world that cuts through a volcanic arc. So it is a huge sediment producer. And because Youngs Bay is attached to the Columbia River, it's probably getting a lot of additional sediment from that source, and I can't account for it in the way that I've estimated sediment supplies. But also hold that thought. Secondly, I'm not going to interpret Alcyon salmon here because they're drowning, and I'm interested in the drivers of salt marshes that are in a dynamic equilibrium with the forcings. And so we know that these systems are probably converting to probably down to a low marsh and ultimately going to drown to a mudflat. But if we looked at just Netarts, Tillamook, Nehalem, and Coquille, there does appear to be this relationship in which the salt marshes that are receiving the greatest fluvial sediment loads are displaying the most positive accretionary balances. And if we think back to Youngs Bay, if we could account for the additional sediment from the Columbia River, it probably would fall much further to the right on this axis. So maybe in some ways that actually kind of corroborates what we're seeing here, which is that ultimately sediment supply along with relative sea level rise rates are explaining the accretion patterns that we're observing along the Oregon coast. And this obviously has important implications for carbon burial because the systems that are receiving the greatest sediment, if they're accreting the fastest, then they're going to have the fastest carbon accumulation rates. Like most good science, I think this posed more questions and challenges than I think it actually ended up addressing. So there's definitely numerous ongoing questions. And one of those questions is how important is fluvial sediment at preserving the drowning of salt marshes across the contiguous United States? We start thinking about systems that have much more limited sediment loads naturally, and also because of anthropogenic activities like damming. And so this is one of the bonus chapters that I'm planning to skip, but I could circle back to if folks are interested. Basically, I worked with folks to measure theoretical sediment supplies to salt marshes of the contiguous United States, and we saw widespread sediment limitations, which surprises nobody. Okay, so the next question that we'll move into is how do perturbations to these systems affect the sediment accretion and carbon burial rates? Specifically, how do land use changes that affect sediment supplies affect these rates of change? And so the first question that I'll pose here is, to what degree does the decadal patterns of Oregon salt marsh accretion and lateral expansion, to what degrees are those patterns explained by the history of intensive timber harvest and climate oscillations? And so once again, Oregon provides us this really great opportunity to address this question because it has a history, a temporal history of really intensive timber harvest. And so for today, we're going to focus primarily on 2 main time periods of interest, 1944 to 1977, which we interpret as a period of high sediment flux, and then 1977 to 2000, which we interpret as a period of very low sediment flux. So for this first time period here, 1944 to 1977, this was just after World War II. There was an economic boom in the area, and there was no EPA generally. And so what we see is this really intensive period of harvest. So the first plot there is looking at board feet area normalized to watershed area. And these practices were super damaging. So in the upper panel, you can see an example of what's called splash damming. So this is when loggers would cut down trees, roll them into the river behind a dam, they would dynamite the dam, and then this torrent of logs and water and probably quite a lot of sediment went down into the coastal ocean. The logs were picked up by in the estuary for milling. So you can imagine lots of sediment being produced here. There was construction of a lot of roads, and all of these negative practices also ultimately led to a series of historic, very infamous wildfires known as the Tillamook burns in the northern Oregon Coast Range. So these burns, I think it was something like 140,000 hectares of old growth forest went up in about a decade. It also just so happens to be a period of the wet phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, where we had greater precipitation, greater discharge. You can see that in this spot here, greater cumulative residual discharge. So once again, greater sediment supplies. Then we move into 1977 to 2000, which is probably a period of very low sediment flux. We move into the dry phase of the PDO, less precipitation, less discharge. And also there's the Northwest Forest Plan was enacted, and just generally timber harvests declined. Okay. So how does this history of suspended sediment flux become reflected in the accretion rate data? So thinking back to the first chapter, what we would expect to see is that we should expect to see, if sediment is actually important in controlling accretion, what we expect is that during the wet phase, vertical accretion should be faster than during the dry phase. And so I reanalyzed the LET210 data and binned it into two time periods of interest, and I compared the accretion rates in box plots here. And what we see is that none of them are significantly different, which really leads to the question, is sediment as important as we had originally thought? And at the very least, I think we can conclude that it doesn't necessarily impact decadal rates of vertical accretion, but what about in terms of the lateral change? So to address the question of how does this history of logging affect lateral salt marsh growth or contraction, I analyzed roughly decadal historical aerial photographs going back to 1939. And here are the results. So here we have the percent area change for 5 different estuaries plotted as bar charts, with the black bar indicating the total area change, and then the colored bars indicating different time periods of change. And so the big takeaway here is that, as expected, during the wet phase of the PDO, which is plotted in the blue, coincident with all of that timber harvest, we see all salt marshes expanded, adding area. And then when we moved into the dry phase of the PDO and we shut off that sediment hose, looking at the orange bars here, all salt marshes entered a period of contraction or their lowest or low rates of lateral expansion. And then moving into the more modern time frame, these trends kind of continue. So clearly salt marshes are reacting to the changes in sediment supply, even on these decadal to multi-decadal timeframes. And so to answer the first question, temporal patterns of sediment supply are partly controlled by land use change, lateral rates of change are partly affected by the history of logging, but vertical rates are not, and that was really surprising. And I think one of the most interesting takeaways here is that when we think about these results in the context of other coastlines that experience a similar history of intensive deforestation, like the northeastern colonization or New Zealand, right now we're seeing salt marshes rapidly contracting. And I guess one big question in my mind is that obviously partly it's going to be because of sea level rise, but also it could partly be because during this period of deforestation, we had this, fire hose of sediment coming down the rivers. Maybe the salt marshes grew to these massive sizes. We've shut the fire hose off. The question is, are they now contracting because they're no longer in a dynamic equilibrium with the amount of sediment coming down the rivers? So, future work. Okay, the bonus chapter here is related to the impact of ditches, another form of anthropogenic activity in salt marshes. So I hand digitized ditches in all the salt marshes from Maine to Virginia to see if they actually impacted the vulnerability of salt marshes. And the answer is sometimes. So I can talk about that if anyone's interested later. But I wanted to now move into the tectonic influences of salt marsh sediment accretion and carbon burial. And so the driving question here is, what was the timescale and mechanisms by which Oregon's salt marshes reestablished following the 1700 Cascadia subduction zone earthquake? And since we are not in Oregon, we're in Florida, I think maybe we need some background on Oregon tectonics. So the Pacific Northwest is an active tectonic margin. It's a subduction zone called the Cascadia subduction zone. And as the Juan de Fuca plate subducts beneath the North American plate, it builds up strain in this lock zone. And then every like 300 to 500 years or so, that strain needs to be released in the form of these megathrust earthquakes. And so the last one that occurred was in 1700. We actually know roughly down to the day and approximate hour. And it happened along the entire length of the fault. It was approximately magnitude 9. Okay, so how is the earthquake deformation cycle reflected in coastal stratigraphy? So imagine you're a salt marsh minding your own business. All of a sudden, earthquake hits. You subside. I've seen some estimates of up to 3 meters in instances. It's probably more like half a meter to 1.5 meters, but 3 sounds more impressive. Now we've gone from high marsh to probably being at least a low marsh, if not like a subtidal area, right? The subduction also causes these massive tsunami. They come in, they rip up all the vegetation. They're going to emplace sand, totally change the environment. We know that salt marshes grow back despite this chaotic event because we have salt marshes now. But the timescales and mechanisms remain poorly constrained. We know it happens through a combination of sediment accumulation, post-seismic rebound, and then interseismic uplift. But again, we don't really know the time frame. And this is just showing that the tsunami deposit is very well preserved in the salt marsh stratigraphy as indicated by the CT scan. We have this very dense layer of sand with an abrupt contact that we interpret as the tsunami deposit. But the reason for this knowledge gap is actually because it's really difficult to date this period of time. And that's because of a plateau in the radiocarbon calibration curve. And I can talk a little bit more about that. But to be able to address the first question that I posed, we actually have to address this first question, which is whether or not we can create a roughly decadal age depth model for the last 300 years. And so I propose to do that using a combination of excess lead-210 and very high depth resolution radiocarbon dating. So I would like to be able to set up Oregon as an ideal natural laboratory experiment to test the combined influences of different amounts of co-seismic subsidence and pluvial sediment supply on the rate of salt marsh equilibrium reestablishment. Basically, how long does it take for the marsh to grow back? But this is a methodological proof of concept, so we're just going to focus on one salt marsh. And so for this, I chose to focus on Netarts Bay, which is sort of in the central part of Oregon. I chose Netarts because it's a small estuary. It's pretty simple to constrain the sediment budgets. We know that it's in a dynamic equilibrium with sea level rise rates right now, so relatively not complex. There's been a huge body of work already. I actually think this might be the most cored salt marsh in the world because it's only about 1 square kilometer. And then the other thing too is that we know that the co-seismic subsidence was about 0.5 meter during the 1700 event. Okay, so I chose Netarts 5 as indicated by the star, and this is the CT scan of that sediment core. So the way that we did the age dating, so obviously knew the depth of the date that I collected the core, so that's the date at the top. 2017, I measured excess lead-210 from 0 to 36 centimeters at 2 centimeter increments. And then I measured radiocarbon at roughly 1 centimeter increments, overlapping the excess lead-210 profile and then just below the sandy tsunami deposit. I then used our Bacon, our Plum, Bayesian models to interpret all of the short-lived radionuclide data. Once I had the age depth model, then I had to analyze the downcore biogeochemistry to assess habitat change through time. I won't talk too much about this. I ended up going with dry bulk density. It's like the most simple method to measure something, and it turned out to be seemingly the best. But I can talk about the other things I tried to. Okay, here are the results. Here's the age depth model in all of its glory. The known date is plotted at the top in blue. The excess lead 210 dates are in green, and then the radiocarbon dates are in red or black, and with red indicating depths that were actually considered outliers, too old based on what we assume to be the age of the tsunami deposit based on all the other stratigraphic work in the region. And I think the model worked pretty well because the average uncertainty down the age depth profile was plus or minus 13 years, with a maximum of plus or minus 25 years, obviously towards the base. And then when I ran the data through the model, I didn't actually tell it what the age of the tsunami deposit was. I wanted to use that as a way of assessing the accuracy. And so it actually dated the buried marsh at 1690 plus or minus 22 years, which I think is pretty good. Okay, so to answer the first question, yes, I think we can. It was a lot of work, but okay, now we have the age depth model, and we can assess how the salt marsh responded to the 1700 earthquake, half-meter of co-seismic subsidence, and tsunami. And so let me show you how we're doing this. So we have the age on this axis. We have the sediment accretion rates, which I can interpret from the age depth model. I use ANCOVA to find significant slope breaks. So that's what's plotted in red. The dashed line is late Holocene relative sea level rise rates. And then the black line is the dry bulk density from the CT scan. So we have that at approximately 1 millimeter resolution, I think. I then compared I looked at modern densities in surface sediments from the different habitats that I have plotted there in the different colors. And so that was how I was able to interpret the stratigraphy. I want to point out, though, that I'm not a biostratigrapher, but there are a bunch of people that have done biostratigraphy, diatoms and forams in this area, and all of this is very in line with what they found in terms of habitat change. Okay, so prior to 1700, the salt marsh was a mature high marsh. It's actually maybe a little bit fresher than the high marshes that we have today. Sediment accretion rates are very similar to relative sea level rise rates, so all that indicates that the system was in a dynamic equilibrium. We have the tsunami, the earthquake, the half-meter of co-seismic subsidence. The salt marsh transitions to a low marsh, lower in the tidal frame. We see that in the densities being higher, and also in the sediment accretion rates being much higher as well. Then at around 1890 or so, the accretion rates drop. They're mirror late Holocene relative sea level rise rates. We're back in dynamic equilibrium, and the densities are lower, indicating more of a high marsh. And of course, out there, the vegetation was a high marsh. Okay, if you were following along, despite the fact that Netarts only experienced a half-meter of co-seismic subsidence, which is like not really that much. Think about a half-meter of sea level rise. When's that going to happen? Like the next 10 years, right? It took 200 years for the salt marsh to regain its pre-earthquake elevation. I don't know if that's a long period of time because we don't have data from other salt marshes to kind of contextualize it. But because we don't have data from other salt marshes, I can speculate. And I'm going to say that I think 200 years is actually relatively slow. I think that probably other systems responded faster. And I think the problem is that Netarts has a sediment limitation. But we need more data to be able to address that question. But the broader implications here are pretty numerous. And I think the one that I want to point out is that if it takes 200 years for the high marsh to reestablish, and if you need the reestablishment of the high marsh to be able to see a change in the stratigraphy, change in the subsidence, right? And that means that if an earthquake happened more frequently than 200 years, then it probably wouldn't have been recorded in the stratigraphy. And so that's a problem because we use the stratigraphy to calculate our recurrence intervals. And so if we're not doing that accurately, then that might mean that our recurrence intervals are not fast enough. And there is actually some indication of this if you look at parts of the plate, parts of the fault that rupture more frequently than others. They seem to have salt marshes that respond more quickly. So food for thought, kind of scary. But moving forward, I'm not going to stop there. I'd like to analyze more salt marshes in Oregon to better test, is 200 years a reasonable time frame or not. I'm also looking to other tectonically active margins. This past summer, I collected cores from around Anchorage in Alaska, as this ghost forest spooky shows here. Okay, lastly, what about biomass? And the question here is, what are the sources of organic carbon sequestered in Oregon salt marshes? And the hypothesis here, it's probably a pretty obvious one, is that salt marshes that have greater fluvial sediment supplies are probably going to bury organic matter from more terrestrial sources. So we can use the Oregon coast as an ideal natural laboratory. Tired of hearing you say that, but we're going to look at these 7 different estuaries again. I measured stable carbon nitrogen isotopes in C to N, and I used Bayesian mixing modeling. And here's the data here. So all of these points are my data points. I focus only on the last 100 years. And we're looking at the colors are the 7 different estuaries, and I've color coded them so that yellow, higher sediment loads, darker blue, lower sediment loads. And what we can see looking at the stable carbon isotopes plotted against the C to N ratio is that the systems that have greater fluvial sediment input seem to be having a fresher organic matter source, whereas the salt marshes that have smaller rivers have a slightly more marine source. But this kind of sucks. Like we can we get good range in the stable carbon isotopes, but the range in the C to N is pretty bad. So what happens when we add in the stable nitrogen isotopes? So same data plotted again, same way, except that the gray boxes are literature-based source ranges. So focusing on the Pacific Northwest with the, I grouped them into things like estuarine categories. So this is like macroalgae and phytoplankton, things like that. Salt marsh, primarily salt marsh vegetation, salt marsh diatoms, and then terrestrial carbon, mostly soil-based. And so we see much better spread in the data now that we've added the stable nitrogen in. And once we use the Bayesian mixing model, what we find is that across all estuaries, about 50% of the salt marsh organic matter is sourced from salt marsh vegetation. And then the other 50% is dependent upon the fluvial sediment load. So looking at this another way, we have sediment load on the both x-axes, and we have the terrestrial organic matter on this y-axis and the estuarine organic matter on that y-axis. I guess I only need to show one of these, but each colored point are the 7 different estuaries. And what we see, unsurprisingly, is that the greater the sediment load, the greater the terrestrial organic matter source. Once again, Young's Bay, we don't really know the sediment load, but it would fall further on the right if we did. Sandon is kind of a weird outlier, but it's like very much a drowned river mouth. There's no bay. So even though it's a small river, there's really no opportunity for a macroalgae type of source. Okay, so the conclusion here, sort of unsurprising that the bigger rivers are bringing more terrestrially sourced organic matter to salt marshes. But what is surprising is that only 50% of the organic matter that's being buried in these salt marshes is actually autochthonously derived, so derived from the salt marsh vegetation in place. And so the implications are kind of important here. If I cared about carbon crediting, which I'm not really an economist, I think you could make an argument that it's kind of important for that. But what I do think is really interesting is that I think this has important implications for climate change mitigation. So if we set up salt marshes as these really efficient systems for burying carbon, it's kind of a problem if a lot of the carbon that they're burying is from terrestrial spheres, because that terrestrial carbon tends to be ancient or pedogenic. So it's out of, it's not really able to buffer modern climate change. So I think it's something that we need to think about when we set these systems up as important blue carbon systems. One super good benefit to this, to me, is that these results are indicating that the biogeochemistry of the sediment is really nicely tied to changes in marine and terrestrial spheres, right? So if the terrestrial sediment supply changes, we're going to expect to see a change in the stable carbon nitrogen isotopes. So that's good for stratigraphers. Okay, the bonus chapter here that I will just sort of tease is that I started thinking about the way that we take masses of organic matter and convert them to volumes in our morphodynamic models, and the ways that we might be overestimating the contribution of organic matter to the geomorphic stability of salt marshes. And so I did this little thought experiment where I tried to calculate, just using math and wild assumptions, how much organic matter might actually be contributing to volume and how much might be sequestered in the dissolved phase. So I can talk a little bit about that if anyone's interested. But I wanted to end the slide show here, but I'll just quickly say that what we saw was that both sea level rise and sediment supply are both important for affecting salt marsh sediment accretion, which has important implications for carbon burial. We also saw that logging and also climate oscillations are going to affect the lateral expansion of salt marshes, but not necessarily vertical, which I think goes back and challenges everything I said in the first chapter. Great. We also saw that it took over 200 years for New Tarts Bay to reestablish, despite really limited post-seismic subsidence, which makes us worried when we think about salt marshes trying to respond to anthropogenic sea level rise right now. And that only 50% of the carbon that gets buried in salt marshes is autochthonous, with important implications for how we value these systems. Okay, that's it. I can take questions.
Student questions?
First off, thank you for sharing your work with us. I was just wondering, how are you able to isolate the direct cause of sediment accretion by looking at?
Yeah. That's such a good and deep question. For those of you on Teams, I'll repeat the question, which is, how can you make wild assumptions about how changes in accretion rates are related to changes in the landscape? Is just throw a lot of data at it and make bivariate plots and then hope that they're significantly okay. I'm sort of tongue in cheek. I typically start with a theoretical, like, if there's more sediment, would that lead to, you know, accretion of the marsh, right? And so once we have sort of a theoretical, like there's a mechanism there, like the mechanism that could potentially explain what we're observing, then I go and create these natural laboratory experiments to sort of set up, like, okay, these two systems, we try to smooth over things like the tidal range is relatively similar. The vegetation assemblages are relatively similar. The temperature of the water in the air are relatively similar. But this system has a massive river and this system has a tiny river. And then we can measure the accretion rates and be like, as we sort of predicted, because there's like a conceptual relationship there, the system that has the massive river is probably getting a lot of sediment from that river. And that's sort of driving the geomorphic patterns that we're observing. Does that kind of answer your question?
Questions from students?
I think I was just curious on, like, how do you get to your conclusion of like 50% of the material? And like, where do you think it's like $50% is going?
Yeah. So the question for those of you on Teams is, how did I come to that conclusion that 50% of the organic matter is from salt marsh vegetation and the other 50% is from marine terrestrial spheres? So I used MixIR, Bayesian mixing model, to basically you define source ranges and sort of say, like, terrestrial carbon tends to fall in this range, terrestrial nitrogen tends to fall in this range, so on and so forth with all your potential sources. And then you put in, it's weird because it was developed for wolves and what they eat, but you put in, like, effectively your wolves, right? And see what they're trying to eat. And then the model spits out a percent. So it's just, Bayesian, not a Bayesian statistician, so I treat it a little bit like a black box, except that I also did a linear mixing model to start out to see, like, okay, like, I understand this math, what am I getting with that? And then let me apply the Bayesian mixing model, which, you know, is supposed to optimize uncertainty, reduce uncertainties, et cetera, et cetera. And I got actually exactly the same numbers from the Bayesian as I did as the linear. So then I was like, okay, it's working. And then I just presented the Bayesian data because it sounds cool, right?
I like the honesty.
Yeah. I mean, I generally believe that the simpler the statistics, the better. And I tend not to like I wouldn't have tried to sell you this nonsense if I didn't like it looks right, right? Like, I'll put the statistics up there, but it looks right too. And once again, there's a mechanistic explanation. I know why these are falling out of line. Yeah. So yeah, so basically the Bayesian mixing model is how I did that. And then one thing I didn't actually present here though is that I looked at changes with time as well, because obviously, I'm sure like half the people in here are like, what about decomposition? If you look at the stable carbon nitrogen isotopes with depth, and I can never remember if it's which direction it is, but whatever trend you expect to see with increasing decomposition with depth, I actually saw the opposite trend. So I'm not going to stand here and say that decomposition isn't happening, but I don't think it's actually the primary temporal process that's affecting changes in source. I think it's actually linked to the earthquake deformation cycle.
Open up to questions from everybody. I had one question, sort of, trying to take this from the West Coast to here, out of your 4 stories, we don't have tectonics. And what's the third one? I forget what your third one was. The last 2 vignettes you gave, it doesn't affect that. Wetlands in this area and pretty much up the East Coast. So how different would you expect your stories to be if you had done this work in North Carolina or Louisiana or here in Florida?
Yeah, well, yeah, great question. So for the Teams room, how do I sort of place the work that I did in a broader context, or maybe even more of like a local context to here on the East Coast, the Gulf Coast. So in especially in terms of the results with the tectonics. Well, so I guess firstly, my cop-out answer is that because it was a methodological proof of concept, I'd like to say that others here could potentially use those same methods, and you could pick something like so the 1700 earthquake was super helpful in the stratigraphy for sort of setting an expectation of like this is the date at this point. Can I assess that the Bayesian age-depth model is working well? So you could pick something here like the introduction of ragweed. I think that was big at least on the East Coast. I don't know about down here, but you could pick some sort of event, right? That you think is dated relatively well, and you could use that as sort of your marker horizon at a point in time beyond the lead-210 profile. How the results of the fact that it took 200 years for the marsh to respond to only half-meter coseismic subsidence. So I hold the belief that we could, if we knew everything that was truly affecting a salt marsh, that we could create a model that has every important parameter, and it could be applicable to the Oregon coast, and it could be applicable to a salt marsh in northern Florida. And I think the problem is that because our models are built on East Coast systems, we tend to gloss over some of those parameters and set them to 0 because here they would be 0, whereas other places, that parameter becomes important. And that's not important so long as that parameter remains 0. But if that parameter starts to increase or decrease or whatever, then it becomes important. And so something like okay. So all of the work in this chapter about suspended sediment really made me go back and question this story here. And the most obvious question would be, is there something that co-varies with sediment load that is actually driving this relationship? And I think the answer is yes, because it's watershed size, because that's how the Sparrow model is derived. And so when we think about the creation of accommodation space, we tend to think about sea level change, because in North Carolina, when sea level rises, that's going to be the primary contributor to the creation of accommodation space. But in Oregon, where you have the Columbia River shooting out like massive amounts of water during a big discharge event, or maybe you even have like Nehalem River, which is, shooting out like still quite a lot of water for the size of the estuary, that's going to also create accommodation space. And so better yet, that creates accommodation space when there's a lot of sediment in the system. So the marsh can accrete at that point in time. And then that happens frequently enough that it sort of maintains the accretion rate of the salt marsh. And so that's an example of a parameter that we might not have included when we created the model on the East Coast, but studying these other systems that have like a greater diversity of processes, or at least a greater range in the processes that we think are important, I think will allow us to better parameterize the models over here. And so when we think about earthquake subsidence, that's effectively just sea level rise, right? And so when we think about that it takes 200 years for a salt marsh to respond to 0.5 meter of sea level rise, when we do some sort of marsh restoration project, like remove a tidal restriction, we're going to change the hydrodynamics of the system in such a way that might cause the marsh to go through a temporary period of loss. And then we need to sort of set our expectations for how long it's going to take for the marsh to grow back. And if we have a couple of different examples in our recent geologic history of where we can actually measure that rate of response, then we might be able to actually set up some accurate expectations. Yeah.
Right.
Is that?
Yeah.
I'll follow up on Brad's question, and thank you for a really intriguing seminar. So your null model, or your hypothetical model, says that sea level rise and accretion are basically balanced, and that's quite satisfying to know that, you know, in the long term we're still going to have salt marsh, et cetera.
Yeah.
Except in a place like Florida, where you've got all these bulkheading of all of the, and you've been on the bay, you saw it, right? So you've got this vertical structure that's not going to allow these salt marshes to necessarily creep back, right?
Yeah.
And so now you've got the sea level rise and the accretion kind of doubling down, as opposed to being offsetting.
Yeah.
And so that probably is not very satisfying in terms of the scenario.
The promise of a rule. Yeah, no, I think I have an answer too.
Unless you have 2 meter subsidence because of an earthquake.
Yeah, right.
Yes. I agree. The promise of a rule is very satisfying. So the Teams room, I'm not sure I can exactly repeat the question, but I think it's related to coastal squeeze. So one way that salt marshes can keep pace with sea level rise without necessarily changing their area or losing elevation is by migrating landward. And that's great if they can do it. The problem is that oftentimes there's hardened structures in the way that prevent that migration. And so a lot of times on the East Coast, especially anywhere sort of south of about Rhode Island, the primary reason why there's going to be a structure in the way is because a human built it, right? Anywhere north of there, it's probably going to be too rocky. And actually, Oregon has a similar issue of coastal squeeze because the foothills of the Oregon Coast Range are tend to be the greatest, like the salt marshes go directly up into that region. And so as sea level rises, the salt marshes are not able to migrate landward. And of course, they're going to drown because of that. So, yeah. When you do, however, have a like some aspects of a river valley, you might start changing like tidally freshwater swamps into more saline influenced, or you might start changing like actual like uninundated forests ultimately into salt marsh. And a lot of the restoration strategies have been focused on facilitating that migration, called facilitated migration. So thanks.